This is the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria, session number 19.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Hey everybody, it's Matt Sikoria coming back at you in session 19 of the Behavioral Observations Podcast. You know, this particular session of the show, it's going to be a little different. This is going to be another experiment, if you will, of having a non-behavior analyst on the show. And I think you're really going to like this one. Let me explain. Several weeks ago, Dr. Gina Green posted an impassioned request to support the Association for Professional Behavior Analysts on Facebook, noting, among other things, that the organization is uniquely suited to advocate for the needs of both practitioners and clients in this unpredictable world of ours. One of the ways that she suggested supporting APBA was to attend the annual conference, which this year is being held in New Orleans. Well, her plea worked on me, and I committed to go after reading her post, and I'm in the process of making travel plans there. And after that, I started to think about, okay, what are some things I could do to help encourage people to go? And so I hope to have a future episode or two that highlights the content of the conference itself. Now, having said that, attending a conference is not only about sitting in a meeting room, taking notes dutifully, and obtaining CE units. I mean, let's be honest, it's an opportunity to travel and see places that one would not ordinarily visit on their own. And because this year's event is in the city of New Orleans, I thought it would be fun to do an episode that highlights some of the non-clinical or practice-related reasons to attend APBA. In order to accomplish this, I reached out to my new friend and fellow podcaster, Mark Bologna of the Beyond Bourbon Street podcast, a show that celebrates all that New Orleans has to offer. In this episode, the New Orleans native gives us perhaps the most concise visitor's guide to the city. We talk about everything from how to get to the conference hotel from the airport to local figures of speech. More importantly, we spend a lot of time talking about cool places to eat, sightsee, and just hang out. Mark shares places to go not only for new visitors to the city, but he also mentions some very cool restaurants that only the locals know about. All in all, there's something for everyone in this episode. And if you're like me, you'll start to get hungry as Mark describes the local cuisine too. From a resources standpoint, this is perhaps the most content-rich episode I've done to date. There are almost 40 links to resources in those show notes. I've listed them in the order in which they appear in the podcast, and I also have them in a downloadable PDF as well. So please feel free to share this with friends and coworkers who are considering a trip to New Orleans, whether for the conference or not. So in closing, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. And without further ado, let's hear from Mark Bologna of the Beyond Bourbon Street podcast. Hey, Mark Bologna, welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Matt. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, this is such a treat for me because I am thrilled to be visiting New Orleans, and I don't even know if I'm saying that right, and I'm sure we'll learn about that as we go here. So, I have always wanted to go to the city, and when I first learned about your podcast and heard about what you're doing down there, and then when I learned the Association for Professional Behavior Analysts is that we're having our conference down there, I was like, oh my gosh, I gotta speak to Mark, and I gotta get him on the show, and hopefully provide some incentive, some cultural incentive, not necessarily the incentive from the standpoint of the content of the conference itself. In other words, what are some fun things to do in New Orleans and things like that. So again, I'm really psyched to have you on the show.
I'm really excited to do it, and I think by the end of it, we'll have people chomping at the bit to come. Not only obviously for the content of the conference, but because we'll have them good and fired up about New Orleans. And I'm looking forward to meeting you in person and seeing you in March as well. So that'll be great.
Yeah, very cool, very cool. All right, so before we get going. Tell me a little bit about yourself. Most of the time when I have a guest on the show, it's usually someone who's notable in the field of behavior analysis and things like that. And so you're one of the very few people who've been on the show who aren't who is neither a practitioner or a scientist in the field of behavior analysis. So tell us about your background and how you got into your connection to New Orleans and
Sure.
your podcasts and things like that.
Sure. I'm happy to do. I'm honored that you actually had someone on that's not a scientist. So I feel like I'm privileged to do that.
That's right. You're in rarefied air. Yes.
There you go. I'll try to hold my own.
Yeah, you'll be fine.
I was born and raised in New Orleans, actually, in the heart of the city, just a couple miles outside the French Quarter. My family, in fact, we all were born, baptized, and went to school within a 1 mile circle of where my dad and mom each were born. So
Really?
grew up with it.
That is so rare these days. It's unbelievable.
It's not so rare in New Orleans, certainly before Katrina.
Mm-hmm.
And I grew up in sort of I believe that New Orleanians are sort of a unique lot anyway. But if you happen to grow up in a restaurant or a music family, it's like yet another level of insiderness.
Okay.
So my family owned a neighborhood place, a restaurant. It was a po' boy place, which is, in other parts of the country, it would be a sub or a hoagie, although the bread's completely different. And so they bought the restaurant when they were 18 or 19 years old, and they had me 9 months later. So they were kids. They were 19 years old. They had a restaurant, and they had a child, and they were kids.
Mm-hmm.
And so I literally grew up in the restaurant. And that was a fabulous way to grow up because you were just so ingrained in the culture of the neighborhood, and with the musicians and the cooks and the chefs that would come in. And so it was just in my blood. I loved the city. Loved sharing it with other people. So I grew up, I moved away as an adult for about 15 years and came back so we could raise our kids here. And most New Orleanians have an email like ready to go or a Word document to answer the question, oh, so we're coming in town for a weekend. What should we do? Where should we eat? That kind of thing.
Oh, you mean so they get hit up all the time from friends and acquaintances and things like that.
Exactly. And so I love sharing New Orleans. I've always loved it. And about a year ago, somebody said, why don't you do a podcast? You love podcasts, and you could share your love of New Orleans and your connections with people in the city with so many more people. I was like, that's an interesting idea. And I kind of stewed on it, and I put one out and got a little bit of feedback, and I love it. I love the opportunity to share New Orleans with people like you and your listeners who are coming to New Orleans for a conference or thinking about coming for a trip. And the gist of it was, I get tired of the national narrative. Once a year at Mardi Gras, you see pictures of Bourbon Street on the national news, and you see people going crazy and doing a lot of things that maybe aren't child appropriate, kid appropriate. And yet we live here. We raise families here. We grow up. We have normal everyday lives against this backdrop of sort of unique and extraordinary play. So
not everyone walks down the street with a hurricane in their hands?
That's right. And most people actually have clothes on, and women don't just flash themselves all the time in the city.
Wait, we're supposed to incentivize people to... No, I'm just kidding.
Oh, I'm sorry. So we'll get to that, right? But it was intentional that the podcast is called Beyond Bourbon Street.
That's right. It's the Beyond Bourbon Street podcast, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so we'll talk about Bourbon Street, I'm sure, in the course of the discussion. But it was really to dispel that myth that that's all there is, right? There's a whole lot more to do, and we'll get into it, obviously. And that was really the gist of it. I love my city. I'm passionate about it. And I get tired of the national narrative that sort of talks about the bad things and the, sort of the headline grabbing stuff.
I see. Now, where did you live when you were outside of the city? When you were away, when you were in exile, if you will.
In exile, that's how I think of it. I was gone for 15 years, and I lived all over. I lived in St. Paul, Minnesota, which, as a New Orleanian, I had never seen snow. And I moved to St. Paul, I think I was 27 years old. And I got there right after a Halloween blizzard, like 40 inches of snow. And I lived in Houston, Nashville, and I spent the last 8 years before we came home in Washington, in D.C.
I see. Okay, so you definitely had a chance to kind of sample various parts of the country, and I've come back to New England. I've been back for about a dozen years or so, having grown up and gone to college, and but having been away for almost a decade. So living in various parts of the country. So it's
sure.
I do think it's a good experience for people to kind of live in different parts of the country. But it's also good to know where you want to be and things like that. So I was just curious about where your other travels took you, but I'm happy to hear that they took you back to New Orleans and you've started this really fun project.
And if I could real quick, I know you and I have spoken, you have young children. And for us, that was our whole thing. When we found out that we were pregnant, or my wife was pregnant, we have twins. We very much wanted to raise the children in New Orleans, which I think surprises people that aren't from here. Because again, they see these things on TV.
Sure.
And we wanted them to know the customs and to know the seasons of the year, which here are not spring, summer, fall, and winter, right? It's carnival season and festival season and Saints season and Mardi Gras. And we want them to ask for beignets and ask for crawfish and gumbo and understand all that stuff. And so it was very deliberate. And I know, the kids are 5 years old, and we're thrilled to have them being raised as little New Orleanians.
Very cool. Very cool. Now, I'm going to ask some kind of specific questions and things like that, but I want to start out with something kind of broad, like, and I think you've got a unique perspective, especially given what you just said. If we're trying to, if someone's on the fence as to whether or not they're going to go to this conference, and this whole episode is about putting the content of the conference itself aside.
Sure.
But I guess my broader question here is, to someone who may be, mulling over whether or not to come, is what makes New Orleans special from your perspective?
I think the easy answer, that's also true, is the food and the music and the culture, but a little bit more nuanced than that. New Orleanians sometimes will refer to New Orleans as the northernmost part of the Caribbean. And if you think about that, right, it has a lot of the music and the vibe and kind of the laid back attitude and the bright colors of the islands in the Caribbean. And at the same time, New Orleans is probably the most European city in the United States. If you've traveled to Europe, if you've been to say Canada as well, you really see the tie with the architecture, the wrought iron, for instance, the design and the architecture of the French Quarter and the Garden District. And you combine all those things. You combine sort of this continental cuisine along with Cajun cuisine, which we'll get into, as well as sort of this Caribbean vibe. I have lived all over. I've been all over, and I'm biased, obviously. But there's just such a unique combination of that.
So it's like a cosmopolitan type of vibe?
A little bit, but it's not like, say, New York or San Francisco, right? It's a much more laid-back experience, and it's sort of dripping with culture. Whether that means music to you or architecture or food, the people are very, very friendly. So if you walk down the street and keep your head down, you're going to have a hard time because people are constantly going to be saying, "Hey, baby, how you doing?" It's just the way it is.
That's a normal greeting.
Absolutely. I met a stranger today, and 30 seconds later, I was giving her a hug before we went on our way.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Some parts of the country, you
I
get arrested for doing that.
I might have scared some of your listeners. But I think that it's so unique as a culture. You don't have anything else like it in the United States. If you're on the fence, get the picture of Bourbon Street out of your head. Although we'll talk about Bourbon Street, I'm sure. But there's so much. If you're into food, if you're into art, if you're into architecture, the streetcars are unique, right? And we'll get into all that, I'm sure.
Oh, all right. So cool. So cool. So the conference is at the Sheraton. And so one of the things I'm thinking about, of course, is, okay, what's nearby?
Sure.
And so what are some, kind of, do you have any cool places to see, things to do, I guess, within a little bit of a distance, perhaps walking distance or a Uber or whatever from the Sheraton?
Sure. So the Sheraton is on Canal Street, and it's just a short walk. If you walked out of the Sheraton and went to your right, you'd walk 4 blocks and you'd be at the Mississippi River. But Canal Street is one of the borders, if you will, of the French Quarter. So you cross Canal Street, which is a very wide street, and you're in the French Quarter from the Sheraton. And so there you have, and we'll get into the French Quarter, but you have all the history that was the original footprint of the city and lots of things to see, do, and eat there. Again, you have the Mississippi River, which I think we take for granted in New Orleans, but if you haven't been here, you walk up to get to the river. So think about that for a second, right? You have to walk up to get to the river.
Wow.
And you start to understand that we're in a bowl here.
Right.
And so that's really, really close to the Sheraton. Behind the Sheraton, you get into our central business district. But the whole metropolitan area is a little over 400,000 people. So while it's our central business district, it's not a chasm like New York or Chicago, right? It's probably a square mile of the business district. And then right behind that's the warehouse district. And so those three areas encompass, you could spend your whole time, your whole afternoons, evenings, any free time, and see plenty of architecture. You could go on a tour. You could have plenty of things to eat. You could go to some really cool bars. But if I were going to walk from the Sheraton, I'd certainly spend a little time in the French Quarter. I would hop on. Another cool thing about the Sheraton actually is you're right at the intersection of two separate streetcar lines. So you have the Canal Street streetcar, which will take you all the way out to City Park, which is about 5 miles. And there's a load of things to do in City Park. And you can also hop on almost at the same corner, maybe a block over, the St. Charles Avenue streetcar. So this is $1.25 each way, right? So it's nothing. You can hop on that streetcar and go through the Garden District and see these tremendous mansions that were built in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s on the backs of sugarcane and cotton and industry, right? And you can keep going. You can stop at a place called the Columns Hotel, which I'm going to date myself, but in the 70s is where they filmed Pretty Baby with a then very young Brooke Shields. Mm-hmm. You can keep going all the way to the end of that line to a wonderful area called the River Bend with shopping and food and bars, coffee shops, and all of that literally within 2 blocks of walking out the front door of the Sheraton would be at your...
For $1.25.
$1.25.
So that can be like the budget tour guide, right? You can just hop on that thing and just ride around, and you can kind of see all these sites as you're kind of going through.
Yep, you can hop off and hop off, grab dinner. So it's $1.25 each way on the streetcar. You can get like a 1-day pass for $3, and they have like a 1-day, a 3-day, a 5-day pass. Mm-hmm. But really, really inexpensive.
Wow.
Yeah, and so you're going to be able to get to 95% of what you might want to see, either by walking or a streetcar from the Sheraton.
I see. And do you buy it right on the streetcar here? I know we're getting down pretty granular here, but
sure.
We kind of like those details in my line of work.
Yeah. So you can pay exact change. You pay $1.25 for the, just to get on each way. You can buy a 1-day pass from the streetcar conductor, or they have a mobile app now. I think it's at RTA Go Mobile or RTA Go. I'll get the link for you.
Okay.
But you can buy it online. So you can buy any of the passes, and then just use your smartphone when you get on. So that's a great way to see the city. And the idea of just riding the streetcars is so cool. It's, for those of you thinking about the trolley in San Francisco, it's a different experience. The streetcar, the green ones, have been running since the 1830s, 1850s. So wow. It's the oldest continually operating streetcar line in the world. And so just riding on the streetcar with the mahogany benches and the sort of the whirring and the clanging of it, that alone is worthwhile.
Yeah, that's a historical experience on its own.
Yeah. And, you and I mentioned at the start, so I have this podcast called Beyond Bourbon Street, and we have a whole episode on streetcars. So about the history and how to do it and all that stuff as well. And I'll certainly give you all those links afterwards so you can share it with your listeners.
All right, cool. So this is just to speak directly to the listeners here, this is going to be an episode where there's going to be tons of show notes. So you're going to want to go to behavioralobservations.com and look for Mark's name, and we'll have the specific episode number and things like that later. But so we'll definitely have those details. And again, just to reiterate, so if someone wants to go to your podcast, they can find all the episodes at beyondbourbonstreet.com. Is it Beyond Bourbon ST period?
Right. It's beyondbourbonst.com, or obviously on iTunes, or so not the street, beyondbourbonst.com.
All right, cool. Very nice. Well, that sounds like a ton of fun, and again, it sounds like a very, very inexpensive way to kind of see a lot with a pretty low level of investment. So, I'm so tempted to dive into like cool restaurants and things to see and things like that. But as I
Sure.
told you, we kind of like the details in my line of work. So, I've never been to the city, so like, and I'm gonna
Okay.
be, flying in. What are the ways in which people kind of enter the city? Obviously for and taking into account that most people are gonna be flying there. Like, so how do people typically get from like the airport to, the downtown area or the area, in and around the Sheraton, things like that? Is there public transportation, or is there, or
Sure.
how do people typically navigate that?
Yeah. So the airport is about 12 to 15 miles from the Sheraton. I don't know the exact number, but it's in that ballpark. The easiest way, there's not effective public transportation to get from the airport to the Sheraton. You have a couple of options, though. Uber, to me, is the easiest. I travel a lot in and out of New Orleans, and Uber's the easiest. And it's gonna be less than $20. If you're by yourself, obviously it'd be cheaper one way. You can take the shuttle services that are in a lot of big cities, right? So you can go to a desk, right, and baggage claim at the airport in New Orleans and arrange a shuttle. From my lens, though, Uber's the way to go. You can also take a taxi, obviously, but I think Uber's the way to go. To me, when you get to New Orleans, you want to be in New Orleans as quickly as you can be, right? You want to get to the hotel, throw your bags, get comfortable, and get out the front door. And the quickest way to do that is going to be an Uber. You're looking at a 20-minute drive from the airport. If you're in traffic, it might be like if you're in rush hour traffic, it might be 35 minutes on the high side. But if you're coming in off hours, 15 to 25 minutes, you're going to go from door to door.
That's nice. Yeah, I've been on a lot of airport shuttles, and it's just dropping people off at different hotels before you get to yours. It can be kind of annoying, certainly. So I think I'll be probably opting for the Uber.
So my
option there.
my advice is to hit the ground and be ready to go, because you're coming, particularly for your listeners that haven't been to New Orleans, or for yourself. You want to be able to soak it all in as quickly as you can.
So our conference is the March 23rd through the 25th. So, in New England, if someone asked me what the weather was like, in late March, it could be anything from, shorts to a parka. We've gotten storms in April. I've skied as late as April 30th. And yet, like a real mild winter like we had last year, we were mountain biking at that time of year. I would imagine that the weather is also variable, in a place that's right off the Gulf. But so bearing all that in mind, is there some sort of range that people can expect? Because I'm trying to think of, okay, how, what information people have that would, kind of allow them to kind of pack accordingly.
Right. So New Orleans, we're a pretty tropical climate here. So in March, typically you're going to see lows in the low 50s and highs in the 70s. So you're going to get, generally speaking, right, the averages that time of year is right about 60 degrees. But you're going to get, say, 50, 52 up to about 75.
Okay.
So you can safely leave your parka at home.
All right,
and your snow boots. You won't have any
Excellent.
problem there. You probably, that time of year, you want to bring a sweater or a light jacket and check the weather, but you're not going to get, probably the hottest you'll get is 78 or 80, which I know coming from some places is going to feel like a heat wave, particularly if you've been in a New England winter. But typically you're going to get, it's actually a great time of year. You're going to get upper 50s at night. You might get to 65, 70 during the day. It's pretty damp here, pretty high humidity most of the year. So when it's cool, it feels colder than the same temperature somewhere else, right? 40 degrees in New Orleans is pretty chill. It's pretty cold. And 75 degrees in New Orleans with a lot of humidity can feel a little bit stickier than you're used to. But you're not going to have to pack heavy clothes. A light sweater, a light jacket, right?
Okay.
That kind of thing.
Very cool. Very cool. Are there any, you mentioned festivals earlier. Do you know of anything specific going on in the time frame that all of us are going to be down there?
Sure. So I certainly want to circle back to some of the things to do in the French Quarter and things that are every day. But yeah, just so you guys are going to be here, I think the 23rd through the 25th or 26th of March. Is that right?
Yep. And you can imagine some people might come a little bit early, stay another day or whatever, and so there might be a little overlap.
Well, I'm about to convince your folks to just move here. But
Okay.
So just to give you a sampling, that week alone is the Tennessee Williams Literary Festival. So you have all kinds of, if you're a book lover or a play lover, Tennessee Williams lover, you have all kinds of things associated with that. So you'll have live performances. You'll certainly have some performance of A Streetcar Named Desire. You'll have literary talks. You'll have authors, different events like that, all associated with that. Kind of on the other end of the literary scale, you also have an event called Saints and Sinners, which I think will be its 14th or 15th year. And that is focused on authors who write about the LGBT community, right? So they kind of play on the saints and sinners idea there, which is interesting against the backdrop of New Orleans.
Sure.
Then you also have, we are in love with festivals. We've always had a lot of festivals, and now we seem to be getting festivals for everything. So right when you guys are here will be our first annual taco festival.
All right. Very cool.
And that's going to be, there's a little park, almost a pocket park called Lafayette Square, which is just, from the Sheraton, it's probably a short 5-block walk. So straight back behind the Sheraton, just a few blocks. It's a great little park. It's small, but they'll set up booths around the edges, and they'll have music in the middle. And the idea of a taco festival might seem strange for New Orleans, but post-Katrina, one of the positives, if you will, that's come out of Katrina is an influx of new people, right? And they bring their own cultures and their own identity and their own influence on our food. So there's certainly been a Latin influence in New Orleans that's been stronger post the storm. But I can't wait for the taco festival because I can just imagine you're going to get barbecue shrimp tacos, which we'll talk about in a minute. It's not barbecue sauce. You're going to get crawfish tacos. Somebody, I am sure, is going to do some sort of fried oyster with a nice sauce on top of a taco. So you're going to get this sort of backdrop of a taco with New Orleans flavors in it.
So this kind of fusion type of cultures.
Yeah.
Oh, man, that sounds awesome.
So that's just 3, Matt, off the top of my head, in the time when you guys are here. Oh, and Chris Rock is going to be performing at the Sanger, which is a classic old, recently renovated live theater. The Sanger is actually on Canal Street, just a couple blocks from you. So if you're a Chris Rock fan, that's also smack dab in the middle of when you guys are going to be here.
Wow. Pretty cool. So you mentioned food.
Yes.
And aside from making me hungry with all that taco talk,
Right.
What are some what are some staple foods or some must-haves or must-tries or whatever that's kind of indigenous to New Orleans that folks should partake in when they're down in the woods?
This, and what I like about this discussion about food is that you can go really high end or really inexpensive or anywhere in the middle. And so let's just first talk about a couple of actual foods, and then we'll talk about where to get them. So New Orleans is we're very well known for our seafood. So you're going to get oysters, if you're into oysters, raw oysters, broiled oysters, fried oysters. Gumbo is terrific in New Orleans. And some people say, oh, well, I'm a picky eater. Well, gumbo comes in many different forms. So you have, my favorite is a style called gumbo yaya, which is really basically chicken and sausage gumbo. So it's an andouille gumbo, which is sort of a spicy andouille sausage, which is a spicy sausage. So you have that. You also have a seafood gumbo, which would have any combination, usually crab, shrimp, maybe crawfish, sometimes oysters. So gumbo, jambalaya, which is a rice-based dish, right? So jambalaya usually has, again, you could have a seafood or a chicken jambalaya. So typically you have chicken and sausage in a jambalaya. Certainly our beignets, which are really cheap at Café du Monde, right, in the French Quarter, and also a place in City Park. I mentioned taking the streetcar out there. There's a place called the Morning Call. But beignets are like a little fried donut with powdered sugar on top. So that's obviously a must-have in New Orleans. Mm-hmm. And then I mentioned in passing barbecue shrimp. So barbecue shrimp is a New Orleans dish that's not barbecue sauce on shrimp, right? Instead, they saute shrimp in a sort of butter, Worcestershire, lemon, garlic, parsley sauce, right? So they saute that, and they usually serve it sometimes over pasta, sometimes over grits, but it's not quite the same as shrimp and grits. That's a terrific dish. So I could go on, but go ahead.
Okay, so may I ask why they call it barbecue shrimp?
So it was originated at a place called Pascal's Manali, and I ought to know that, and I don't know. I think at Pascal's Manali, they originally lightly grilled the shrimp, so that was the idea of sort of barbecue, right?
Okay.
But it's an unfortunate name because it turns everyone off.
Right.
And it could not be further from your vision of barbecue sauce poured over shrimp, right?
Okay. All right. Very cool. Very cool.
So all of those dishes, and also I should mention black and red fish, which the blackened craze in the 1990s was originated here in New Orleans by a chef who's deceased now. He died this year, Paul Prudhomme. Mm-hmm. And so Prudhomme was pretty famous. He was a very large, rotund guy.
Oh, yeah.
And he used to write cooking show. And so he created this blackened dish, which was a slice of redfish that he would put his own sauces on, own seasonings on, and blacken sometimes on a cedar plank, right, in a cast iron skillet. It became so popular that the Louisiana legislature had to change the law and limit the fishing of Gulf-caught redfish because they were fishing them out of existence because of the popularity of the dish. So today they've adjusted that, and you can get that dish.
I see.
Couple of things, though. All those dishes I just mentioned, you can walk from the Sheraton into the French Quarter and get great versions of all those things.
Very cool. Are there? Is there like a must-see type of restaurant or bar or cafe?
Sure. So definitely, I think when you come to New Orleans, you want to have beignets. Mm-hmm. And if you're in the French Quarter, the place to go is Café du Monde. So that is right on. So the heart of the French Quarter is Jackson Square. So most people have seen the iconic statue of Andrew Jackson on a horse that's rearing up in Jackson Square. And right behind that is St. Louis Cathedral. So generally, any postcards you see of New Orleans are going to have that vision on it. Well, right at the front of that square is Decatur Street. And so on Decatur, between Decatur and the river, which is just a sliver right there, is Café du Monde. So that's coffee and beignets. They're open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So that's good for breakfast. It's good for a snack. If you happen to, not that any of this audience would, but if you happen to be out late and have a drink and need something to maybe soak some of that up, beignets are great. And beignets are like, I forget what the price is now, but it's in the neighborhood of like $3.65 an order. Mm-hmm. So it's dirt cheap. So you definitely want to have beignets, and you want to go to Café du Monde. One of my favorites in the French Quarter is a place called the Gumbo Shop. The Gumbo Shop is sort of equal parts tourist and locals, and they do really good, maybe not the best ever, but really good representations of a couple different kinds of gumbo, of crawfish étouffée, which I didn't mention. It's a crawfish, sort of a smothered crawfish dish over rice, and of jambalaya. So that's a great place you can go and get sort of a sample platter, if you will. Mm-hmm. Almost like Creole tapas, if you will. So little small plates. It's a good place to go share if you want to do that and everybody try something. But you can get a sample platter of 3 or 4 things for $20 or so. To give you an idea, one of our traditions used to be, before we had the kids, we'd go to midnight mass at St. Louis Cathedral, or late night mass on Christmas Eve, and then we would walk down to the Gumbo Shop. So that gives you a sense of if that's something we're going to do as folks that were born and raised here. Lots of people do it. If you want a sort of nice meal, and very few places in New Orleans are expensive compared to my experiences across the country. But there's a place called Mr. B's Bistro in the French Quarter. Mm-hmm. Most New Orleanians have a last meal in mind. So if you said, Mark, you got one last meal left, what would it be? And for me, I would go to Mr. B's. And I would have the gumbo yaya, which is that chicken and andouille gumbo. I'd have the barbecue shrimp, and I'd have creme brulee for dessert.
Wow.
So I don't know that I could give a higher recommendation of a place. That's a place I'd definitely go. Reservations are a good idea there. You don't need reservations at the Gumbo Shop. If you are a foodie, you should make reservations at Commander's Palace, which is a short Uber ride from where the Sheraton is. It is it's just an incredible place with fabulous food. A James Beard award-winning chef at Commander's Palace. You're going to get any of the classic dishes you could think of when it comes to New Orleans there, and just have sort of a fine dining meal. If you are sort of a classic into history and food, in the heart of the French Quarter is Antoine's. Antoine's is the oldest family-owned restaurant in the United States. It dates back to the mid-1800s. And not only do they have great food, so if you think about New Orleans and you're a foodie and you think, gosh, I want to try all the classics, that's a place to go.
Antoine's?
Antoine's.
Okay.
And here's a tip. If you do that, if you go to Antoine's, once you order your food, ask for a tour. And they'll take you on a tour and tell you the history of the restaurant, show you their 25,000 bottle wine cellar, talk about some of the former occupants of the building and the whole history. And it's really sort of a great New Orleans experience to do that.
Now, how hard is it to get a table at either Commander's Palace or Antoine's?
So you probably want to make reservations, say 2 weeks in advance, maybe a little bit more if you know you're coming. You could do it the day before, depending, right? If you're trying to get a table in the middle of the week on a Wednesday, you probably could get an early table even the day before. But if it were me, as soon as I booked my reservation to come to the conference, I'd think about where I want to go. And I'd make a couple reservations. Even if you don't know who you're going to have with you for dinner, make a couple reservations for 4 people or 6 people and have that good to go.
Mm-hmm. And you can cancel them as long as you give them a good notice or whatever.
Yeah, and there's plenty of places that don't need reservations, but those two in particular, if I were going to Antoine's or Commander's, I would do that. Can I give you one more sort of I'm going to give you 2 off the beaten path ideas.
Well, this is why you're on the podcast, Mark, to give this local intel. So by all means.
So those places are great. I wouldn't mention them if I didn't love them. But here's what you want to do if you want to be an insider. So you want to hop on that green St. Charles streetcar, and you want to take it and enjoy seeing the mansions in the Garden District. You want to take it all the way to an area called Carrollton and River Bend. So it's about 4 miles, 5 miles. You could Uber to this area. There's 2 restaurants out there that I really love. There's a bunch of restaurants, but one called Giacomo's. So it's JACQUES-IMO, Giacomo's, right? Mm-hmm. And I'll send you all this, Matt.
Okay.
That place only takes reservations for 6 or more. And this is not a place, I'm going to say so much that people are going to say no before I ever get to the punchline, but if you are very worried about pristine conditions and you want white tablecloths and you want this sort of, sterile meal, don't go there.
Okay.
If you want the place that New Orleanians go, that's a little cluttered on the outside, this is the place for you. So you go in Giacomo's. First you go in a bar, which that's not a big deal. But when they seat you, you actually have to walk through the kitchen. And you have to dodge the folks that are reaching into the coolers to get the food to cook, right? Having said all that, when you get beyond that, the food is terrific. The portions are ridiculously large. But everything they produce there is excellent. It's one of the places we take visitors. But it's not, if you are prim and proper, and that's okay, don't go to Giacomo.
I see. But if you want the real deal.
If you want the right kind of, again, that's where I would take you. That's where I would take somebody that says, hey, can you take me out to dinner?
Oh, man.
Not far from there. So if you are more of a white tablecloth but want to get away from everyone and not run into anyone, of course, I'm about to give it away. There's a place called Brigtson's. I should have had this written down. BRIGTSEN, Brigtson's, Frank Brigtson. So this is tucked in that same neighborhood. You could take a streetcar or an Uber, and you probably want to make reservations at Brigtson's. He is a chef that worked with Paul Prudhomme in the 90s at Commander's Palace and then went on to own his own restaurant. Frank Brigtson is really known for seafood and for duck. So if you like duck, you like seafood, it's a great place to be. It's tucked into this neighborhood. It feels like you're among houses because there's 2 restaurants across the street from each other, and then there's a bunch of houses. And it's in a fairly small place. It was a house, but you won't run into any other visitors unless people hear this podcast, of course.
Right.
And it's a real insider place for a nice meal. It's not dirt cheap, but it's certainly not expensive. And again, I'll give you all those links afterwards, and you can post it so people can take a look. But that would be a lovely place, particularly if you've been to New Orleans before and you want to get a little bit off the beaten path, but not far away, Brightson's is a winner.
Well, that, you kind of preempted a couple of questions in your description of both of these places. One of the questions I had is that there are going to be people at this conference who I would imagine that a lot of practitioners and behavior analysts in general in the Louisiana, excuse me, in the New Orleans and Louisiana area are going to attend this, so they might have some familiarity with the city. Sure. And so I was going to ask you what would be some sort of interesting and unique place that's not really part of the touristy scene. But also another question I had was so let's say some folks take this advice of yours and they hop a streetcar out and they're at Giacomo's, especially. Let's just consider that as an example. And if they want to, what are some what's some lingo? You kind of talked about this earlier. People greeting you with saying like "Hey, baby" or whatever, So
right.
If you want to kind of fit in, what's some local lingo that people typically use in your neck of the woods?
Sure. So if I can, right before I get to that, there's two more restaurants that popped in my mind. One of them, I happen to see my wife out of the corner of my eye, and if I don't mention her favorite restaurant in the city, I'm going to get understandably a glare.
Okay.
So
well, let's prevent
two
that.
more
so
places.
Go right ahead.
Real quick is a place called Clancy's. So Clancy's would be considered sort of a classic New Orleans bistro. So what that means here is all the typical things that I talked about. You'll get great fried oysters there. You'll get a little bit of an Italian bent, great seafood specials. And that's a place that people aren't going to find on their own. So that's an Uber. It's in uptown New Orleans, so it's not far from the streetcar, but you wouldn't want to take a streetcar. But you look that up. It's Clancy's. It literally house, Clancy's, house, right? They don't even, I think, have a sign hanging. It's just written on the window. So you need to know it's there. But we love it for a couple of reasons. The food's great. The service is wonderful. But it just feels like a New Orleans restaurant to us. We walk in and we always see somebody we know. It's sort of upscale casual, if you will, but that's a terrific restaurant. And then the second one I wanted to mention, then I promise I'll get back to the language. Because you guys are on Canal Street, you can walk out the front door and take the streetcar away from the river. So the Canal Street streetcar is red. The St. Charles ones are green. There's a neighborhood restaurant called Katie's. Katie's is literally a corner restaurant, bar kind of place. They have they have a great redfish dish. They have great gumbo. They have terrific po' boys. It's not expensive, but it's a wonderful, wonderful place. And for your listeners that stay at the Sheraton, you just take the streetcar headed away from the river. And this is going to get into your language question.
Okay.
They get off at South Telemachus, right? Telemachus is the way they say it here, but South Telemachus Street, and it's a block walk. So you could take a $7 Uber, or you could take a $1.25 cab, or a streetcar ride, excuse me. And Katie's is just a terrific place. I think they're closed on Tuesdays. You have to check that. But really good, casual, locals place. So that would be a fun place. If getting back to your language question, though, so we'll hit some of them. Again, I don't want to overly push the podcast on you, but there's so much language in New Orleans. We actually did a whole episode about it.
Okay.
And so I'll give you the link to that later, but it's basically the language of New Orleans.
And do you know the episode number off the top of your head, or the title of the episode?
I will give it to you in just a second.
Okay.
The language of New Orleans is episode 11. And it really was about 40 of the most common things. But let me give you a little primer.
All right.
First of all, we don't say you guys, we say y'all. Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay. Well, I went to Auburn University, so I'm familiar with that a little bit.
All right. Everybody is baby, right? So it's not. We're not trying to come on to you. It's very, how you doing, baby? Good to see you, baby. We're pretty into hugs, and people are pretty friendly here. So again, people are going to start up a conversation with you pretty easily. We have a tradition. So a lot of our street names have a blend of Indian names. So very close to where you would be staying if you stayed at the Sheraton. As you walk towards the river, you'll come across a street called Chapatulas. And that's a great, like, if you want to impress your other friends that just showed up at the conference, no one can say Tchoupitoulas.
Tchoupitoulas.
Yeah, it's Tchou.
Okay, I was going to say, it's going to be spelled weird if
Yeah. So Tchoupitoulas. In the French Quarter, there's Chartres Street. So we, in the French Quarter particularly, we have a lot of the French names still. But Tchoupitoulas throws people. Étouffée throws people. So I mentioned that in passing before. Étouffée is usually a crawfish dish. So if you think of crawfish sort of smothered with a little bit of sauce and some bell peppers, right? That's served over a bed of rice. So that's crawfish étouffée. So you hear that a lot. We in the Garden District, I mentioned, it's pretty interesting. Some of the streets are named after the Muses, but we slaughter almost all of the names. So instead of Melpomene, it'd be Melpomene, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
So we aren't real good with proper pronunciation here.
I see. That's pretty funny.
We say "where you at" a lot, and that's sort of a term of endearment. Like "where you at" means "how you doing, Matt?"
Okay.
And you'll hear people say, "Where you at?" Right? Well, the other thing you want to watch if you're in the French Quarter, particularly if you are wearing decent shoes, and I know that sounds funny, you'll have people say, "Hey, I bet you I know where you got those shoes." Well, it's a con, and what they're trying to do is you'll say, "There's no way you know where I got those shoes from," right? And they'll say, "You got them on the bottom of the soles of your feet in the middle of New Orleans in the French Quarter." Okay?
That's
So
a normal interaction.
That's a normal scam interaction in the French Quarter. But if you're wearing nice shoes and you walk through the French Quarter, somebody will walk up to you and ask you where you got your shoes.
And so while we're on the topic of scams and what are they trying to scam, and what are some other things that a naive traveler like myself would want to look out for, in terms of either getting taken advantage of, or from a safety perspective, or whatever. We'll
Sure.
talk a little bit about that.
I think that New Orleans is a big city, so we certainly have big city crime and all of the caveats and sort of things you would tell anyone going to a big city, right? You want to be mindful. You can often find yourself in crowds, particularly in the French Quarter. So you want to do what you would normally do in a crowd, right? You don't necessarily want to have a big purse if you're a woman or a guy for that matter. You want to, generally you want to put your money in your front pocket. You want to put your phone in your front pocket. You don't want to bring a ton of stuff. But for the most part, the crime that you see in New Orleans on television generally happens late at night. So, if you're back in your room at a reasonable hour, you're okay. Most of the people that run into problems, it's 2, 3, 4 in the morning. Maybe they've had quite a bit more than a little bit to drink. They wander off. They're by themselves. Again, the same kind of things that could happen in any big city.
Sure.
So I think in the French Quarter, you want to be aware of your surroundings. You don't want to get ridiculously drunk so that you're not in control of the situation. It's not a great idea to walk by yourself late at night. The French Quarter is, sort of a party place, but it's also a neighborhood. And that's what people don't realize. If you get just a block or two off of the main drags, off of Bourbon Street, off of Royal or Decatur, you're in a neighborhood, and it can be a quiet neighborhood. And so if you think about walking through any neighborhood late at night, you just want to be aware. So those typical things apply. For the most part, the Sheraton is a great location. And we haven't talked about it yet, but again, I did mention right behind the Sheraton is the Central Business District, and behind that, if you will, meaning away from the French Quarter, is the Warehouse District. There are lots of good little boutique kind of places to stay if you don't want to stay at the Sheraton or don't want to stay in sort of a big hotel. And we can talk about that.
Sure.
All those places are fine to stay. Just be aware of your surroundings. So other than where you got your shoes, you're not going to run into a scam. You just want to be aware. Again, most of the crime you see is people being out really late, being really drunk, and just sort of not following the principles you would tell anyone to follow in a big city.
I see. You mentioned kind of boutique hotels and things like that. So if someone didn't want to stay at the Sheraton but wanted to be close by, and what would be some alternative lodging arrangements or places to stay and things like that?
Sure. There There's several. In the area right behind the Sheraton, there's a place called the Q&R. It's actually part of the Marriott. Marriott has a thing called the Autograph Collection, and it's a small little. It feels very boutique, but it kind of is the best of both of those worlds in that you sort of have the consistency of a bigger brand, but it feels much smaller. It's actually called the Q&C. Excuse me, the Q&C Hotel Bar Collection. Mm-hmm. And that's on Camp Street. It's just a few blocks behind the Sheraton. That's a place we recommend to visitors all the time. It has, again, that boutique feel with maybe the consistency of a bigger hotel. It's got a great little bar in it, and it's got all the things you would want in a bar in terms of great drinks and sort of kind of a nice scene at happy hour. But it also has plenty of Wi-Fi and plug-in spots and all that. So if you got a laptop with you and you got to get a little bit of work done, but you want to enjoy yourself too, you can sit there at a long sort of communal table, and you'll find people in the afternoon doing some work and also enjoying a little bit of New Orleans hospitality. There's a tiny little place not far from the Sheraton called the Catahoula. So that's Catahoula, the Catahoula. Mm-hmm. And I think it's like 35 rooms, so it's tiny. But that's a pretty cool little spot. They have two bars in there, both like an inside bar and then a rooftop bar. And it's a little quirky, but it's nice. That would be a great spot if you want something a little bit different. In the French Quarter is a really nice boutique hotel called the Bienville House. So when the rates are good there, that's a wonderful place. It's closer to Canal Street, but just a few blocks from Bourbon. So it's got this it's inside the French Quarter, but it's away from the noise a little bit. The Bienville House. And they have this wonderful tiki bar there. So that's a pretty cool thing if you're into that. A couple more if I could. The Roosevelt Hotel is a classic old hotel that's a Waldorf Astoria, excuse me. And the nice thing about that is that's a Hilton brand. So if you have Hilton points and you want sort of an old world feel, if you can get a good rate at the Roosevelt or you use points, that's just a couple blocks from the Sheraton, but is a really nice place.
Go ahead. Keep going.
One more. The Renaissance Arts. So that's in the Warehouse District, which would be really close to the Taco Festival. And that's
Bonus.
A Renaissance. There you go. So the Renaissance, I think that's a Marriott brand, so you could use points. But it's only a 4-story hotel. So when we didn't live here, we would stay there often because it's in a great spot for bars and restaurants, and you can walk to the French Quarter if you want, but it's away from it. And because it's only 4 stories, it doesn't feel like a big Marriott or a big Sheraton, right? Mm-hmm. So that's just a handful of kind of a range there for you.
Okay, and do those kind of span the budgetary options?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, if you're a points person, you have not only the Sheraton. Across the street from the Sheraton is a Marriott. That Renaissance is, that's a branded hotel. That's a Marriott hotel. The Roosevelt, again, is a Hilton. And right down the street up against the river, if you're a Westin or a Starwood member, is a Westin hotel with gorgeous views of the Mississippi River. So you kind of got several choices there, where you might pay or you might use points. Okay. But that's a pretty good range of prices, too, you could find in those hotels.
Very cool. Now, you mentioned, a little bit about architecture and art and shopping and things like that. We've talked a lot about bars and restaurants and
Of course we have.
Yeah, of course, right? So let's say you had an afternoon off, right? Let's say you had a nighttime flight, and it's the day after the conference or something like that, and you don't want to get on that plane either full, extremely stuffed with food or in other conditions, if you will, sure. or if that's just not the food and beverage thing is not your thing, what are some other types of, things people could spend an afternoon doing in New Orleans?
Sure. A couple of things. I love the tours, and there's so many different walking tours, but I'll highlight a couple of them. If I had an afternoon, like you're saying, and I've never been to New Orleans, I would split my time one of two ways. If I was into museums and history, I would go to Jackson Square. And again, if you're in Jackson Square and you look one direction, you're looking towards the Mississippi River. If you look towards the city, you see the iconic, the thing that's on postcards. You'll see St. Louis Cathedral, which is a Catholic cathedral in the heart of the square there. And then on either side, you have a museum. One's called the Cabildo and one's called the Presbytere. And they're both part of the Louisiana museum system. And so they have regular exhibits and they have rotating exhibits. But in those two museums, and you can pay one price, I think it's like maybe $14 for both. You can see a history about Mardi Gras. You can see an exhibit about the signing of the Louisiana Purchase. You can get the sort of whole history of New Orleans. One of them has an exhibit about Katrina. So you could really dive into history there. Probably the direction I would steer you, though, if you had an afternoon, is I'd go take a tour, maybe of the Garden District. So there's a tour group. There's a lot of tours, but one I particularly like is a little company called Two Chicks Walking Tours. Yeah, okay. It's the owner is a woman named Christine Miller, and like the name implies, what I like about it is it's a little bit tongue in cheek, right? They don't take themselves so seriously, but they're really good. The tour guides know their history, and everyone that goes on those tours say they learn a lot, they see a lot, and they have a lot of fun. And so they do a variety of tours, and there's other groups, but a walking tour of the Garden District would be the way that I would steer you, because you just see this mass, the wealth that must have existed in the 1800s, to see these mansions that are so colossal. And there's such a collection of them. There's so many, just one after another after another. And then if you're into sort of a little bit of seeing where the stars live. So these things were built by magnates of industry back then. And really that goes to the Louisiana Purchase. After the Louisiana Purchase, people largely from Midwestern America moved here. These were titans of industry at the time. They made their fortunes on cotton and sugarcane and import-export. And they didn't want to live with the Creoles in the French Quarter. They wanted their own neighborhood. And so that became the Garden District. So you can go see where they lived, and now you can see, Archie Manning is quite popular, was quite popular in the NFL, and his brother sure. Eli. But of course, they are the sons of Archie Manning, who is as much New Orleans royalty as you can get. The Mannings grew up in the Garden District, so certainly any tour guide would point out their home.
All right, so I'm a Patriots fan, so I think I'm going to steer clear away from.
You should probably keep that to yourself when you come to visit. Although the Patriots had a Super Bowl win here, but so a Garden District tour I would definitely do. Alternatively, you could do a French Quarter tour. Again, I think Two Chicks Walking Tours offers them, but there's several tour companies in the French Quarter. So I think one of those two things. If I had half a day, because I think the architecture is so unique. And it just sort of drips, if you will, all the details. And so particularly, like you said, if maybe I'm not into drinking or I've had plenty enough food, you get a little bit of exercise too, right, on the walking tour. If you hadn't done it to that point, and you really should, go take a streetcar ride. There's so much beauty to see. And again, it's $1.25 and you get to sort of just tour. Even if you just took it to the end, hopped off, got back on, it's relaxing. That time of year. So here's a tip. The green streetcars, they are on the historical register, which means they need to be true to the original streetcars. What that means, the translation is they don't have air conditioning. Mm-hmm. So the windows are all down. Well, that's pleasant in March. It's a little less pleasant in August.
Oh my gosh.
But you won't have that problem. So those two things, or to see the museums. Besides the two I mentioned, if you're a music fan, it's called the Old U.S. Mint. It actually was a mint. In fact, it's the only mint in the United States that at one time or another produced currency for both the Confederates and then the Union side.
At the same time?
Not at the same time, but, right, but very close. And so it's in the French Quarter, but the unique thing about it is not only they no longer produce currency, but they certainly have an exhibit about currency and about that unique thing, the fact that they produce currency for both sides at different times. But it's now dedicated to music and to the history of jazz, which originated in New Orleans. So that's a pretty neat museum, and it's free to go in, and it's easy to tour. So that's a fun thing. So you could just explore the French Quarter, go see a couple museums, have some beignets, get a cup of coffee. go up to the river. So a really fun, cheap thing to do is that you'll see pralines. I should have mentioned that. Pralines are, a Southern tradition, usually with, it's made of sugar and sometimes buttermilk, some cream, some vanilla, and pecans. So you can buy these for $1.50 a piece. One of our favorite things to do is go buy a couple from different places that you'll see in the French Quarter. Just buy 3 or 4 and go get a cup of coffee and walk up to the river. Again, walk up to the river.
Right.
Sit on a park bench and sample them, have a little taste test, and watch the ships go by on the river.
Wow. Pretty cool. And one thing we didn't really touch on that much is you mentioned a couple times, but the music scene. Now, I remember listening to one of your shows, and at least the takeaway point is that it seems like there's music in just about everywhere in terms of restaurants, bars. Right. You even mentioned music in a park and things like that.
Sure. So you definitely it's hard to escape music in New Orleans, and you shouldn't. There are wonderful street musicians in the French Quarter. So if you go to Jackson Square, you'll often hear or see on the corners of the square, you'll see street musicians playing. If you go down Royal Street, which is one of the main streets in the French Quarter, there are often street musicians playing. If you're real into jazz, Preservation Hall in the heart of the French Quarter has live music in the evenings, and they're interesting in that they are dedicated to, just what their title says, preserving the jazz tradition. And they still have, although it literally is a dying breed, they have musicians that performed with Louis Armstrong and performed in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, along with newer musicians who they're teaching the tradition, right? So you can go in there and hear these musicians 70, 80, 90 years old sometimes performing and preserving the sort of traditional New Orleans jazz and sort of fusing that with modern traditions. So that's a fun thing to do. The title of my podcast is Beyond Bourbon Street, and that's for a reason. At the same time, I think that if you've never been to New Orleans, you should spend a little time on Bourbon Street. If it's only to take a walk down the length of it just to see the craziness, there are lots of tourist traps on Bourbon Street. There's not the best music clubs, but it's certainly a fun spot, right? You can go hear cover bands there, and you can go, there's a fun karaoke place called Cat's Meow. Right off Bourbon Street, you can go to Pat O'Brien's, which of course is iconic for hurricanes. So while you're not going to get the absolute best music, you should go do that one night just to see it, even if it's not your thing. But in terms of music, you want to get off of Bourbon Street. Again, Preservation Hall. There's a bunch of the thing to do really is to look up on a calendar when you get close. There's a free New Orleans paper called the Gambit, Gambit, and they'll have a listing, like most big cities, right? It's a free paper. You pick it up almost anywhere, and they'll have a good listing, or you can go on their website. I think if Kermit Ruffins is playing, so Ruffins, he was featured in the HBO series Treme. If anybody saw that series, it was on for 4 seasons, and it depicted life after Hurricane Katrina here in New Orleans. But Kermit Ruffins is a New Orleans musician. He plays the trumpet and is an absolute character. So if you want to see sort of New Orleans music, he's one to check. Another guy is Big Sam. He has a band called Sam's Funky Nation, Big Sam's Funky Nation. So lots of tuba and trombone and brass. So that's a fun thing. In the French Quarter we have a House of Blues. So that's a good place to check and see what's playing. But you definitely, if you have a love of music, you want to check out some music while you're here. And certainly that taco festival will have live music during the festival. So that'd be fun as well.
Wow. Well, we've certainly covered the gambit here of everything from lodging to transportation to
right,
architecture and art and music and certainly food and drink. Do you have any closing thoughts to the listeners here as we this hour just kind of flew by? So.
Sure. Yeah, I think if you were on the fence, hopefully you're not. What I would say to you is there is something for everyone. Again, you just mentioned it, Matt. If you're into food, it is, in my opinion, my biased opinion, the finest food place in the country because of the variety. And the average sort of neighborhood place is so much better than the average virtually any other place I've been. But you have the food, you have the music, you have the culture, you have the architecture. Don't be afraid of what you might have seen on TV, right? There's so much to get into. I can't think of an interest that you might have that would be tough. I actually have a visitor this week who is a vegan, and I thought, boy, that's going to be a tough call in New Orleans. And yet she's been to loads of places and had terrific food. So I guess the bottom line is, look, you're coming for a good reason, the conference and the content, but I can't think of another place that you're going to be able to walk out the doors of the host hotel and be able to tap into virtually any interest you would have. And as we mentioned, Matt, many of them are free or really, really inexpensive.
Oh, I like those attributes very much so. Mark Bologna, it is, again, Beyond Bourbon Street, the podcast, and beyondbourbonost.com is where people can check out the various episodes, and I would recommend people do that, because you've got episodes on a whole host of topics that kind of touch on the various things that we've talked about today. So, man, I am so looking forward to going down there and taking in all that New Orleans has to offer. And so thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I can't wait to meet you in person and to show you around my hometown.
Oh, man, can't wait. All right, take care.
Thank you.
All right, bye. Hey, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this travel edition of the Behavioral Observations podcast, and I hope it's inspired you to attend APBA this year, or at the very least just to visit New Orleans if you have the chance. So, again, special thanks to Mark Bologna for coming on the show and sharing his insight of the city he loves so much. You can learn more about him and his podcast, which is also super informative, at beyondbourbonost.com. Or you can go on iTunes and just search Beyond Bourbon Street Podcast, and it should pop right up. So there are show notes aplenty at behavioralobservations.com/session19. And so we'll have all the links there. Like I said, there's almost 40 links to various resources in this episode, and it's all there in the show notes in the order in which they've appeared. So behavioralobservations.com/session19, and you'll be good to go. And I hope to see you guys in New Orleans. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.